graders, welcome to my outdoor classroom. Hope you're all staying safe and healthy at home, and we know your families are taking good care of you. Just wanted to do a little fraction review with you for this week's math work. A couple of things we're going to go over today. On my little whiteboard here, sometimes you're asked to make an equivalent fraction for a fraction that's already given to you. So if I have the fraction 1/3, there's a couple of different ways I can find an equivalent fraction. But the quickest and easiest way is to just pick a low number and multiply your numerator and denominator by that same number. If I pick 0, I'm just going to get 0 over 0. We don't want that. If I pick 1, I'm going to get the same thing that I started with, 1/3. So I'm going to pick 2. Remember, we're multiplying the top and the bottom, our numerator and our denominator, by the same number. 1 times 2 is 2. 3 times 2 is 6. You've heard us say it a lot of times. Whatever you do to the top, you have to do to the bottom, and vice versa. This is the same situation here. A lot of what we do in our fraction world too is just find fractions that are equivalent to other fractions. Think about sometimes when you have an answer and your teachers ask you to simplify your answer. All we're really doing is giving another version for that same fraction. It's just an easier one to work with. But in this case, we made an equivalent fraction for 1/3. This means that 1/3 and 2/6 are the same exact thing. They just look a little bit different. Sometimes you're given a mixed number and you have to turn it into an improper fraction. Remember that little trick, MAD? We want to go ahead and multiply, then add, and my favorite part, just keep the same denominator. I like to do the easy part first, so I'm just going to bring my denominator right over. Denominator of 2. Multiply the 2 times the 2. Keep the answer in your head because you're going to have to add it with that top number. 2 times 2 is 4. 4 plus 1 is 5. Once again, all we're doing here is giving another version of 2 1/2. 2 1/2 is the same as 5 halves. Sometimes you're going to be asked to turn an improper fraction back into a mixed number, which if you think about it, we could take 5, divide it by 2, and guess what we would get? 2 1/2. So I'm going to show you how to do that with a different improper fraction, like 16/3. A fraction bar really just means divide. So think of taking that top number and divide it by the bottom. So I'm going to set up my division here. 3 goes into 16 5 times. 5 times 3 is 15. Subtract and get a 1. Now it's time to put it all together as a mixed number. It went in 5 whole times. There was 1 left over. And once again, same trick from before, it's the same denominator. Keep that 3. Once again, 16/3, 5 1/3, they mean the same thing. They just look a little bit different. And we could check our work and see if this really equals that. Let's use math. 3 times 5 is 15, plus 1 is 16, over 3, and you get your original of 16/3. I'm going to take a little eraser break so I can show you a couple of other things. It's really fun to do math outside when it's nice out. Just a little something different than being inside. Another thing that I wanted to point out is if you have your take-home folder at home, you can go ahead and slip a piece of paper in it and use this as a whiteboard too. We've been doing that a lot at home these past couple of weeks. So a couple of other things just to refresh your memory with fractions. This one's a little bit hard to erase. And did you notice what I'm using? One of Cameron's old socks. I promise it's clean. Doesn't smell. He'd be really embarrassed if I told you that. Alright, a couple of other things that I want to show you is sometimes you're asked to order fractions. So if I'm given the fractions 1/3, 1/2, and 3/4, please don't order them just by looking at them. You actually have to do some work to be able to order them. You could draw pictures using fraction strips, but once again, I really like to use numbers, so what you want to do is find a common denominator for all of them. I have a pretty cool trick for you, and that trick is, if you look at these numbers, you can multiply them all by each other, and you'll get something called the quick common denominator. It's a denominator that will work for all 3. So let's try that. 3 times 2 is 6 times 4 is 24. That means I can use a 24 for all of those fractions before I get ready to order them. By the way, once we change our bottoms, think about our tops. Are our tops going to stay the same? No way. Because whatever you do to the bottom, you have to do to the top and vice versa. Don't forget that. So think about how I would get from a 3 to a 24. Well, it's by multiplying, and it's times 8. The same thing we're going to do to that 1. 1 times 8 is 8. Once again, we're just making fractions that mean the same thing, they just look a little different. 1/3 and 8/24, they mean the same exact thing. Let's do the same for the 1/2. I know that 2 times 12 is 24, so I'm going to multiply the 1 times 12 and get 12. Last but not least, to get from a 4 to a 24, and I hope you're noticing that each number we're using is a little different each time. To get from a 4 to a 24, it's going to be times 6. So I'm going to do that same thing to my top. 3 times 6 is 18. Now, whether the directions told me to order from least to greatest or greatest to least, I'm ready to order because now I have my tops that are different where my bottoms all match, so I can honestly compare the 3 tops. The last thing that I wanted to show you is that when you are putting something in simplest form, so if I have something like, let's say 10/20ths. If I want to get it to simplest form, I can think of a number that goes into both 10 and 20. When I say go into, that's key for divide. I want to think of a number that can go into 10 and 20. In this case, 10 and 20 have a couple of numbers in common. So watch what's going to happen. I'm going to use my really good trick that knowing 10 and 20 are even, I can divide them by 2. So if I divide the top and bottom by 2, I get 5/10. Now, most kiddos would go, okay, I'm done. I divided, so I must be in simplest form. Unfortunately, though, you always have to be thinking, do they have anything else in common? And could I go further? Well, 5 and 10, they do have something in common. I can't use my 2 trick because 5 is odd, but 5 and 10 have a 5 in common. Remember when you're trying to pick something they have in common, it can't be bigger than your smallest number because it wouldn't fit inside of it. So if I divide the top by 5 and the bottom by 5, I now have 1/2 squeeze all the way over here if you can see it. So 10/20ths in simplest form isn't 5/10, it's 1/2. And you know what I'm going to say? These all mean the same thing, they just look a little bit different. Oh yeah, one other trick. When you get ready to divide or subtract with mixed numbers today, make sure before you subtract anything, you go ahead and change these guys into improper fractions. Think about that math, that little cycle where you multiply, add, keep the denominator. Multiply, add, keep the denominator. Subtract them out. And don't forget too, sometimes when you get to the end, you're not in simplest form, so keep going to make sure you are. If you guys have any questions, please be sure to email or call your teachers. Reach out to them through our school phone or our school email, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. Stay safe and healthy, and for now, we'll see you next Monday, Delavan.